For 35 years, Sarah had believed her life was built on love and trust. Her marriage to Mark, a successful businessman in Las Vegas, seemed unshakable, until a seemingly innocent grocery trip turned her world upside down. As Sarah strolled down the familiar aisles, she stumbled upon a shocking discovery that would unravel everything she thought she knew. A second family, a secret life, and a betrayal so deep it threatened to tear apart the life they had shared. It was an ordinary Saturday morning in Las Vegas, a city often associated with glitz, glamour, and high stakes. Yet, for Sarah, it was just another day of running errands. With the warm desert sun peeking through the curtains, she made her way to the kitchen, where the sound of coffee brewing filled the otherwise quiet house. Her husband, Mark, had already left for the day. It wasn't unusual for him to be out early on weekends. He was a corporate executive with a demanding job, one that sometimes required him to be away from home for days at a time. But Sarah never thought much about it. Their marriage had been stable, as far as she could tell. After 18 years, things had settled into a comfortable routine, with the occasional weekend trip or dinner date to keep the spark alive. Sarah was just finishing up with breakfast when she decided it was time to head to the grocery store. The pantry needed replenishing, and she had a few errands to run before meeting her friend for lunch. As she gathered her purse and keys, she noticed something odd. Mark's phone, usually left charging on his nightstand, was missing. She didn't think much of it. Maybe he had taken it with him to work, though he had never done so in the past. It was just another small inconsistency, one she tucked away in her mind for later. The grocery store was only a short drive away, and Sarah found herself weaving through the aisles with her usual list in hand. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she pushed the cart, gathering everything she needed. It wasn't until she rounded the corner by the dairy section that her routine trip took an unexpected turn. There, at the end of the aisle, stood a woman. It was a woman Sarah had never seen before, but there was something strangely familiar about her. The woman had long, dark hair and a radiant smile. She was dressed in a loose-fitting sweater, and her eyes met Sarah's in a brief moment of recognition. As Sarah reached for the yogurt on the shelf, the woman glanced over, her expression turning to one of subtle surprise. She didn't say anything, but Sarah could see it in her face. Something that seemed both welcoming and guarded. The woman turned, walking away in the opposite direction, disappearing into the crowd of shoppers. Sarah, though slightly puzzled, didn't give it another thought. But something about the encounter lingered in her mind, nagging at her as she continued her shopping. It wasn't until she moved towards the checkout line that she saw the woman again. This time, the woman was with a child, an adolescent girl probably no older than 10 or 11. Sarah tried to shake the feeling that she was being watched. As the woman and her daughter disappeared into the parking lot, a sense of discomfort crept over Sarah. She finished her shopping quickly, her thoughts elsewhere, but something was off. She loaded her groceries into the car, telling herself it was just a coincidence, just an unfamiliar face in a busy store. As she pulled out of the parking lot, she saw the woman once again, but this time, the woman wasn't alone. She was walking beside a man, Mark, her husband. The sight of them together was a jarring, incongruent moment. Mark was supposed to be working. He was never home during the day on weekends. Sarah's first instinct was disbelief, but as she followed them from a distance, the puzzle pieces slowly began to form a picture she wasn't prepared for. Mark was laughing, leaning down to speak to the young girl, his arm around her shoulder. The woman smiled up at him, her expression one of fondness, one that Sarah had never seen before. They didn't notice her, and Sarah made sure to keep her distance, her hands gripping the steering wheel. As the reality of the situation started to sink in, she couldn't understand what she was seeing. Her heart raced as she tried to process the image of Mark with this woman, someone who was clearly important to him. And then there was the child, someone she didn't recognize, someone who seemed so at ease with Mark. The man she had known for years, the man who had promised her love and fidelity, was now standing there with another woman and her daughter, as though they were a family. It wasn't just the momentary shock of the encounter that troubled her. It was the nagging question of how long this had been going on. Mark had always been secretive about his weekend activities, often leaving early and returning late, but Sarah had never questioned it. They had built a life together, a life that had felt safe, predictable. But now, all of that felt like it was crumbling before her eyes. As she drove home, Sarah's mind raced. She tried to rationalize what she had seen. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe she had misinterpreted the situation. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the case. This wasn't just a chance meeting. This was something more. Something that had been hidden from her for years. The life she had known, the one she had trusted, was beginning to unravel. When she arrived home, the house was eerily quiet. Mark's car was parked in the driveway, but he wasn't there. He had probably gone to pick up some dry cleaning, she thought. But even that thought seemed far-fetched now. Sarah walked into the house, her thoughts clouded by the image of her husband with another woman. How could he have kept this from her for so long? How could he have built an entire life with someone else without her knowing? Her mind kept replaying the scene she had witnessed in the parking lot. The woman's smile, the child's laughter, Mark's tender gestures. She felt betrayed, hurt, and confused all at once. The grocery bags in her hands felt heavier than they ever had before. She had trusted Mark with her life, with her heart, and now it seemed that trust had been shattered. She needed answers, but where could she even begin? What was she supposed to do with the truth she had just uncovered? As Sarah stood in the living room, her eyes scanning the familiar surroundings of her home, a whirlwind of emotions overtook her. The house, once a symbol of safety and shared memories, now felt foreign, like a cold, empty shell. Her thoughts circled around the encounter at the grocery store, the image of Mark with that woman and child, so vivid in her mind. The more she tried to push the memory away, the stronger it clung to her. The more she tried to push the memory away, the stronger it clung to her. There was no escaping the fact that something was terribly wrong. She put the grocery bags on the kitchen counter, her hands trembling as she began to unpack the items. The mundane task of putting away food seemed almost absurd now, as if the world outside had shifted into something unfamiliar. Sarah's mind raced, searching for an explanation, some rational reason that could make sense of what she had just witnessed. But all her thoughts led to the same conclusion. Mark had a secret life, one that she had been completely unaware of. The hours dragged on, and Mark still hadn't come home. Sarah couldn't bring herself to relax, couldn't escape the gnawing feeling of betrayal that lingered in her chest. She couldn't understand how Mark could have hidden this from her for so long. They had been married for over 18 years. Their relationship was built on mutual respect, trust, and love. At least, that's what she had always believed. But now, the foundation of their marriage seemed as fragile as glass, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. As the evening approached and the shadows grew longer, Sarah's unease deepened. She glanced at the clock. 6:30 p.m. Mark had always been home by now, but tonight there was no sign of him. She picked up her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. She thought about calling him, asking him where he was, but the words stuck in her throat. What was she supposed to say? How could she even begin to confront him about something like this? The thought of confrontation terrified her. What if she was wrong? What if she had misinterpreted everything? But deep down, Sarah knew that wasn't the case. She had seen the way Mark had interacted with the woman and the child. His affectionate gestures, the ease with which they spoke to each other, that wasn't something a casual acquaintance would do. It wasn't just a chance encounter. It was something much deeper. By the time the clock struck 8 p.m., Sarah had made up her mind. She couldn't continue to live in the dark, pretending everything was fine when she knew it wasn't. She had to confront Mark, had to find out the truth no matter how painful it might be. But where was he? Sarah had no idea where he had gone or why he was taking so long to return home. She tried calling him several times, but each time the call went unanswered. Her stomach tightened with anxiety. Every unanswered call felt like a small betrayal, a confirmation that Mark was avoiding her. Her mind kept going back to the woman who had looked at her so calmly, so knowingly, as if Sarah were the intruder in a world that she didn't belong to. The image of the woman's smile, the way she had stood with Mark and that little girl, kept replaying in Sarah's mind. It felt as though the woman was a part of something she wasn't, like an unknown chapter in the life she thought she knew so well. In an attempt to distract herself, Sarah decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. The cool evening air greeted her as she stepped outside, the hum of the city fading into the distance. The quiet of the suburban streets seemed almost surreal after the chaos of her thoughts. But no matter how far she walked, she couldn't escape the questions that haunted her. What had Mark been hiding all these years? Had he been seeing this woman for months? Was this affair the reason he had become so distant in recent months? She walked aimlessly, her thoughts clouded by anger and confusion. How could Mark have done this to her? They had built a life together, raised 2 children, made memories, and grown old together. But now it seemed like all of that was a lie, a carefully constructed illusion that had concealed the truth from her. Sarah didn't know how long she had been walking when she finally decided to turn back home. The night had settled in, and the streetlights cast a soft glow on the pavement as she made her way back to the house. When she entered the front door, she found Mark standing in the hallway, his coat draped over his arm, his face unreadable. He looked up when she entered, a brief flash of surprise crossing his features. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah's heart raced in her chest as she stood frozen, trying to gauge his mood. But no words came. Mark's usual easygoing demeanor was absent. The man who had always been so quick to greet her with a smile now seemed like a stranger. Mark's silence was deafening, and Sarah knew that the time had come. She had to ask him. She had to demand the truth. But as she opened her mouth to speak, her mind went blank. How could she put this all into words? What could she say to confront him without sounding desperate, paranoid, or accusatory? Finally, Mark broke the silence. "What's going on, Sarah?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "You've been acting strange all day. Is everything okay?" Sarah looked at him, her mind clouded with a mixture of anger and confusion. How could he act as if everything was normal, as if nothing had changed? But she knew the answer. He had been living a lie, and now he was desperately trying to hold on to the facade. "Where were you today?" Sarah asked, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding. "Who were you with?" Mark's eyes widened, his expression briefly faltering before he regained composure. "I was at work," he replied, a slight tension in his voice. "I had a meeting that ran late." Sarah couldn't contain the storm of emotions that surged within her. "I saw you today, Mark," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I saw you with her. With that woman and her daughter." Mark's face paled as his body stiffened. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Sarah could see the flicker of guilt in his eyes, but he quickly masked it, attempting to regain control of the situation. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice low, almost pleading, but Sarah wasn't buying it. She had seen enough. The truth was there, right in front of her. It had always been there, lurking just beneath the surface of their marriage, and now it was time for Mark to face the consequences. Sometimes the truth is out there, close to us. If you're enjoying this documentary, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more interesting true crime stories. The confrontation hung heavily between them like a storm waiting to break. Mark's face had gone pale, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to hold his composure. For a long moment, neither of them moved, their eyes locked in a silent battle. Sarah stood there, her breath shallow, her pulse racing. Every word she had been holding back for so long was ready to spill out, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. The air in the room was thick with tension, and the silence was deafening. Mark cleared his throat, breaking the stalemate. "It's not what you think, Sarah," he said, his voice shaky but trying to sound reassuring. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Sarah's eyes narrowed and her lips pressed into a thin line. "You didn't mean for any of this to happen." Her voice was barely a whisper, yet the words cut through the air. "You didn't mean for me to find out. For the truth to come to light." Mark's eyes shifted nervously, avoiding her gaze. He took a step back, as if trying to distance himself from the storm he knew was coming. His usual calm demeanor had vanished, replaced by a man who seemed lost, scrambling for words to justify his actions. Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of disgust welling up inside her. She had trusted this man for nearly 2 decades, and now he was standing in front of her, unraveling before her eyes. "I can explain," Mark said, his voice faltering. He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes desperate. It was never supposed to go this far. Sarah folded her arms across her chest, shaking her head. How long, Mark? How long have you been lying to me? Her voice was quiet, almost controlled, but the pain in her words was undeniable. Every piece of their life together was now in question. The time they had spent raising children, the vacations they had taken, the everyday moments they had shared, they all felt like lies. I never meant for it to happen this way, Mark said again, his eyes pleading. He seemed to be searching for something in her face, some hint of understanding, some sign that she would forgive him, but Sarah felt no sympathy. She had been betrayed by the one person she had trusted the most. She looked at him, her mind reeling. She had spent years of her life building a family with him, never once suspecting that the man she had loved and built a life with could hide such a dark secret. It wasn't just the affair that hurt. It was the realization that Mark had spent years deceiving her, maintaining a life she had never even known existed. It made every shared smile, every word of affection seem empty, as if they had all been part of some elaborate charade. Mark let out a deep sigh, his shoulders slumping. He looked defeated, as though the weight of his lies had finally caught up with him. I'm sorry, Sarah. I never wanted to hurt you. I got involved with her a few years ago. I didn't plan on it. It just happened. It happened, Sarah repeated, her voice filled with disbelief. You didn't plan on it, but you've been seeing her and keeping a secret family for years, and you think I'll just forgive you because it happened? Mark looked away, unable to meet her gaze. It wasn't like that. I didn't mean to fall for her. It was just a mistake. His voice trailed off, but Sarah wasn't listening anymore. She had heard enough. You've been lying to me for years, Mark, she said, her voice firm. How many other things have you been hiding? How many more lies have you told? For the first time in the conversation, Mark's expression seemed to crack. His shoulders slumped further, and he looked almost defeated, as if he knew that nothing he said could undo the damage he had caused. He looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with regret. But Sarah couldn't bring herself to feel sorry for him. The years of lies, the betrayal, it was all too much. I didn't want this to happen, Mark said softly, as though trying to convince himself. I never wanted to hurt you. Sarah shook her head, the words catching in her throat. It doesn't matter now. I don't care about your regrets or excuses. The truth is out, and I can't pretend like everything's okay. Mark opened his mouth as though to say something else, but no words came out. He looked lost, his face a mixture of confusion, guilt, and fear. For a moment, Sarah almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But the sorrow she felt was overshadowed by a growing rage, a fury that seemed to be building with every passing second. The life they had built together had been nothing but a lie, and Sarah wasn't sure how to even begin processing the betrayal. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything. She thought about the woman she had seen at the grocery store, the way Mark had looked at her. There had been no shame in his eyes, no sense of guilt. If anything, there had been a warmth in his gaze, a familiarity that made Sarah's blood boil. How could he have done this to her? How could he have done this to their children? You're right, Mark said quietly, breaking her train of thought. I've lied to you, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't know what I was thinking. Sarah looked at him with contempt, her arms still crossed. You don't know what you were thinking, she repeated. Mark, you've been carrying on with her for years, and you don't know what you were thinking? Mark's face flushed, but he remained silent. His inability to offer a real explanation only added fuel to the fire. He didn't even seem to grasp the gravity of the situation. All these years, he had thought he could keep both lives hidden, but now everything was exposed, and there was no going back. Sarah's emotions were raw, her mind swirling with questions that would never be answered. How could someone she had loved and trusted for so long betray her in such a way? Was their entire marriage just a performance for the outside world? She looked at Mark again, her heart heavy with disappointment. I don't want to hear any more of your excuses, Sarah said, her voice cold. You've made your choice, and now I have to make mine. The words hung in the air like a verdict, final and unyielding. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Mark seemed to be waiting for her to say something else, but Sarah's mind was made up. There was nothing more to say. She couldn't keep living a lie. She couldn't continue to stay in a marriage that was built on deceit. Turning on her heel, Sarah walked out of the room, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the empty hallway. She needed to leave. She needed to get away from Mark, to process everything, to figure out what her next steps would be. But one thing was certain. She couldn't stay in a marriage with a man who had so casually discarded their life together for another family. As she grabbed her coat and headed toward the door, Sarah knew that things would never be the same again. The door slammed shut behind her as Sarah stepped out of the house, her heart pounding in her chest. The air outside felt cool against her flushed skin, but it did nothing to calm the storm inside her. Her mind was racing, her thoughts jumbled with disbelief, hurt, and anger. She had thought she knew Mark, believed she had spent decades with a man who loved her, a man who valued their family. But now, everything has shattered. Nothing about their life together seemed real anymore. She walked aimlessly down the street, her mind drifting back to the images that had been burned into her memory. The sight of Mark in that grocery store, the way he had held his other family together so effortlessly, while she stood in the background, oblivious to the double life he had been leading. Every moment, every word he had ever said to her, now felt tainted. Sarah couldn't understand how someone could deceive her so completely. It wasn't just an affair, it was an entire second life, and she had been kept in the dark for years. Her thoughts were interrupted when her phone buzzed in her pocket. With a heavy sigh, she pulled it out, half expecting it to be Mark, trying to explain himself again. But it wasn't him. It was a message from her best friend, Janet, asking if she was okay. She quickly typed a reply, telling Janet everything, her fingers moving in a blur as she recounted the shocking discovery. As she hit send, she felt a rush of emotions surge through her. Betrayal, frustration, sadness, and for the first time she felt an overwhelming sense of relief. She wasn't alone anymore. Janet knew the truth now, and for the first time in hours, she didn't feel like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Sarah found herself standing in the middle of the street, staring at the bright lights of the city stretching out before her. Las Vegas, her home for so many years, seemed so foreign now. It was as though the entire city had been built on illusions, and her life had been one of them. She was just another person trying to live out a dream, never suspecting that the foundation beneath her had been built on lies. As the minutes passed, she started to walk again, her steps growing more purposeful. She had to get out of there, out of the house, away from the memories, away from the man who had betrayed her. But where would she go? She didn't want to go back to the house, not yet. Not while Mark was still there, trying to make things right. When there was no making it right, the trust between them had been completely shattered, and there was no coming back from that. She thought about the children, her grown children, who had always looked up to Mark as their father, as a man who could do no wrong. What would they think when they found out the truth? Would they ever be able to forgive him? She had never imagined this would happen to them, that their world would be turned upside down in the blink of an eye. The betrayal wasn't just hers to carry, it was theirs too. With a deep breath, Sarah made a decision. She needed to clear her head, to step away from the chaos and the heartbreak. She would stay with Janet for a while, at least until she figured out what to do next. She needed space, time to process everything. Mark was right about one thing. He had hurt her beyond repair, and now it was time for her to take control of her life again. She walked to the nearby bus stop, unsure of what she was going to do, but certain of one thing. She couldn't go back to him. Not now. Not ever. The bus ride to Janet's apartment felt like a blur. Sarah gazed out the window, watching the world pass by, but her mind was elsewhere. She was lost in the storm of emotions that had overwhelmed her since she discovered the truth. She could still hear Mark's voice in her head, repeating over and over that he never meant for any of this to happen, that it was all a mistake. But the truth was, it didn't matter what he meant. The damage was done, and no apology could undo the years of lies. When Sarah arrived at Janet's apartment, her friend was waiting for her at the door. Janet embraced her, pulling her into a tight hug, and for a moment, Sarah felt a flicker of comfort in the warmth of her friend's arms. She had no idea what she was going to do next, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't face this alone. Janet led her to the couch, where Sarah collapsed, exhausted both mentally and physically. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the day sink in. It was all too much, too fast. Everything she thought she knew about her life had changed in an instant. She had been married to a man who had never truly been faithful to her, and now she was left to pick up the pieces of her broken heart. "What are you going to do, Sarah?" Janet asked, her voice soft but laced with concern. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her voice distant. "I just don't know." The silence that followed was heavy, but it was also comforting. At this moment, there were no answers. There was no way to fix what had been broken. All Sarah could do was take things one step at a time, trying to figure out how to move forward in a world that no longer felt familiar. As the hours passed, Sarah's mind began to slow. The rush of emotions, the anger, the sadness, it all started to fade, leaving behind a numbness that was almost a relief. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was starting to see things clearly. The shock had worn off, and now it was time to face the reality of her situation. She knew that her life would never be the same. The man she had trusted, the man she had built a life with, was nothing more than a stranger now. She would have to rebuild, piece by piece, her heart, her life, and her sense of self. But she wasn't alone anymore. She had Janet by her side, and that meant more than words could express. In the days that followed, Sarah focused on herself. She spent time with friends, talked to her children, and started to take control of her life again. Slowly but surely, the weight of the betrayal began to lift. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to move forward. As for Mark, he would have to face the consequences of his actions. Sarah didn't know what would happen to their marriage, or if it was even salvageable, but she wasn't going to wait around for him to make things right. The ball was in her court now, and as she stood at the threshold of a new chapter, Sarah realized that, for the first time in a long time, she was in control of her own destiny. The journey ahead would be long, but it was hers to navigate, and she was no longer afraid to face the future. What if you stumbled upon a hidden truth that turned your entire world upside down? What would you do? Could you forgive, or would the betrayal run too deep? If you're hooked, don't miss out. Subscribe now to dive deeper into true crime stories, uncover hidden secrets, and explore the mysteries that keep us up at night.